Chapter 3 of The World's Worst Children by David Walliams, narrated by me. Chapter 3 Nigel Nit-Boy. Nits are itchy, nits are scratchy, nits are scritchy, nits are a nuisance. Not for Nigel. Nigel was a boy who could never have enough nits. He wanted his hair crawling with them. Our tale begins on the morning that Nigel woke up to discover he had a nit living in his hair. Most of us would be appalled and immediately try to evict the nit. Not Nigel. He was delighted. The boy called his nit Mr. Henderson. Nigel didn't have a dog or a cat or a hamster, so he treated his nit like a pet. He made sure he never combed his hair. Nits hate combs, so Nigel's hair was wild and frizzy like a great big bush. A jungle paradise for nits. Nigel fed Mr. Henderson tidbits of dandruff. Nits love dandruff, in the hope of training him up to do tricks, like leaping from one side of Nigel's head to the other. Soon afterwards, Nigel heard of another child at school who had nits. Her name was Tina Ting. Nigel wanted Tina's nits more than he wanted anything in the world. He wanted nits, 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 and more nits. At the break time, Nigel chased the poor girl around the playground. "What do you want?" cried Tina tearfully. "I'm not playing it." "I want your nits," replied the boy. "My nits? You are nuts," yelled the girl. "Yes, I am nuts for nits." The boy tripped over a skateboard and flew through the air toward her. Clonk! The head bashed in an instant. Tina's nits crawled over to Nigel's head. A little dazed, the boy was none the less happy. Now Mr. Henderson had some company. The next day, Nigel heard of a boy in school who had nits. Colin Clont. Nigel wanted those nits so badly, so he chased Colin down to the corridor and cornered him in the toilets. The trembling boy locked himself up in the cubicle. But Nigel would not give up. He climbed over the top of the next cubicle and dangled upside down from the ceiling. Nigel and Colin's heads knocked together. Bonk! Once again, the nit sprang across from Nigel's head. Even the school cat was not safe from Nigel's advances. When Nigel was told that Minky the cat also had nits, he pursued the poor creature across the football field. Once he had caught the cat, he sellotaped it to his head. It looked like a very unconvincing wig. Still, one by one, the cat's nits pounded up onto Nigel's head. Soon, Nigel had so many nits that even his nits had nits. He stopped counting them at 1,000,003. Now you may be wondering, why Nigel wanted a head full of nits? Please let me explain. Ever since he was a toddler, Nigel had spent his days reading comics. The boy was short for his age, if you don't count the wild bush of hair on top of his head. He wanted to be strong and powerful, like the characters in his comics. However, Nigel had a very normal upbringing. He had not been lucky enough to have been bitten by a radioactive spider, or come from a Viking planet, or fallen down a well of bats. Besides, he found superheroes a bit boring. They were always doing good. The supervillains were so much more thrilling. Before long, naughty Nigel had a plan. One morning, as the boy was standing in the bathroom cleaning his teeth, he looked at himself in the mirror. His hair was now not so much of a bush, but a hedgerow. Nigel could not remember the last time he had either cut or combed it. Buzzing in and out of this hedgerow of hair were billions of nits, forming a dark cloud around him. The day has finally come. My nit-based superpower is ready. From this day on, the world will know me as Nit-Boy. Best of all, his name hadn't already been taken, so now that Nigel had all his nits, he went about getting a costume made. Fortunately, the boy's Auntie Pat was quite good at sewing, and put together a supervillain costume for his nephew in no time. Nigel wore a cape fashioned from one of his mum's skirts, an NB logo for Nit-Boy sewn by Auntie Pat, his dad's old Y fronts, his nana's tights, Wellington boots. Nigel had a superpower. He had his name. His costume was on. He was Nit-Boy. At once he began his supervillainy. The next morning he strode into school, his cape flapping in the wind. First, Nigel vowed to get revenge of his geography teacher, Mr. Drumhum. Nigel found geography boring and spent most of his lessons reading comic books. Mr. Drumhum had given the boy detention after detention. Now, Nit-Boy stood at the door to his classroom. Initially, there were hoots of laughter from the other children. What with his costume and shrumbland of hair, the would-be supervillain did not look quite a sight. Ha ha ha! However, the laughter turned into awe as the boy called out his first command. Nits! Swarm! The billions of nits that were whirling around his head formed a black mass next to him. Nigel, what on earth do you think you're doing? Demanded Mr. Drumhum. Nits! Attack! Shouted the boy. They swarmed the geography teacher, nipping him all over with their tiny nit claws. Ah! Screamed Mr. Drumhum as he raced out of the classroom. All his pupils pressed their faces up against the windows to watch their teacher. The man was trying desperately to fend off the nits. He was hopping and spinning and slapping himself as he sped across the playing field towards the school pond. Mr. Drumhum then leaped with a giant splosh. He finally had some relief from the nit nips, though now he was submerged in green water with a fat frog sitting on his head. Nit-Boy smiled to himself. This was going to be fun. Next, he marched across the playground to the dining hall. The dinner lady, Mrs. Droop, was something of a dragon. Boiled broccoli was a signature dish. Whatever you choose, even jam, roly-poly and custard, Mrs. Droop would then spoon heaps of a green watery mush on top. Then she would stalk up and down the dining tables, twirling her ladle like a baton, threatening to rap the knuckles of anyone who didn't eat up every last mouthful. Nigel hated broccoli. If Superman feared kryptonite, Nit-Boy was terrified of broccoli. Now he was to have his revenge of the woman who had made him eat a mountain of it. Nigel, she purred as she strode in. Why have you got pants on over your trousers? Mrs. Droop's smile was wiped off her face as soon as Nit-Boy shouted his next command. Nits! To the broccoli! I'm not having your blasted head lice messing with my delicious broccoli, protested the dinner lady. Too late. The nits have swarmed into a whirling tornado. Mrs. Droop stood open-mouthed in the shock, and the twisting vortex spun over to her precious trays of broccoli. Then the tornado started firing the damp, limp vegetable straight at Mrs. Droop. Splat, splat, splat! Soggy four-lay after soggy four-lay splattered across the woman's face until Mrs. Droop was a damp, green vegetable mess. Now Nit-Boy was ready to have his revenge on the headmaster. The elderly Mrs. Sourchops had suspended Nigel from school after his 10th detention for reading comic books and lessons. The headmaster was a small and timid man, so Nit-Boy thought he would frighten him. Nigel stood in the playground just below the window of the headmaster's office. He closed his eyes in concentration. Nits! Shapeshift! He ordered. Slowly, the tiny insects swarmed together into the shape of a giant super nit. They were able to read their master's mind. As the boy kept his eyes tightly shut, a look of intense concentration on his face. The giant nit-shaped surged upwards to the headmaster's window. It banged on the glass with its huge claw. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Mr. Sourchops swiveled around in his chair and shrieked, No! The giant nit bashed into its great head against the window, breaking the glass. Crack! Help! Screamed the headmaster as he dashed out of his office. Running into the playground, Mr. Sourchops spotted a wheelie bin. Checking behind himself all the time for the giant super nit, the little old man pushed the bin as hard as he could before leaping into it, and he was speeding away. Finally, Nit-Boy opened his eyes and watched in glee as his headmaster trundled across the playground in the bin. It bashed into a low wall. Clank! Sending the little old man flying through the air straight into a tree trunk. Clunk! The Nits swarmed back to their headmaster's head as Nigel strode out of school gates. There was plenty more supervillainy to be done. Not long after Nit-Boy arrived in the market square, which was teeming with bargain hunters, using his nits, Nigel spelled out the letters of a very rude word in the sky. Bottoms. One old lady was so shocked that she fainted at the sight. Next, Nit-Boy turned his attention to the local toy shop. The supervillain ordered his nits to steal every single item in the store, including the till. The shop owner chased the boy down the street, but he was whacked over the head by the nits with one of his own giant teddy bears. Yet there was still more chaos and destruction to come. Suddenly, light flashed and a siren wailed. The police had been sent to stop Nigel from creating further mayhem, but Nit-Boy orders his nits to attack the police car, and they swarmed onto its windscreen. The glass became so thick with nits that the policeman crashed straight into the window of the optician's. Smash! Optician, now you can see where you're going. Nothing could stop Nit-Boy now. He felt invincible. Soon the whole world would kneel before him. All hail Nit-Boy! Later that night, Nigel had put on his pyjamas and was lying in bed. Even supervillains need their sleep. The boy was dreaming up the next day's evil schemes. However, outside in the street stood a throng of townsfolk, armed in the flaming torches and pitchforks, as in tradition with angry mobs, but with an array of combs. Nit-Boy had to be robbed of one of his powers, and there was only one way to do that. They began to chant, "Comb his hair! Comb his hair!" The chant became louder and louder as the mob grew angrier and angrier. Nigel leapt from his bed and peeked out the window. Looking down, he saw more and more people rushing out of their houses to join the horde. In a swirling whirl of nits, Nigel changed out of the pyjamas to become Nit-Boy. He marched outside and approached the mob, with his Wellington boots on and his cape, which was really one of his mum's old skirts, flapping in the wind. Nit-Boy felt ready to take on the world. His millions of nits had now multiplied into billions, or maybe even trillions. They buzzed round the boy's head, blacking out the scattering of stars in the night sky. It would be hard to give you an exact number because nits won't stay still, making counting them impossible. "There he is," shouted someone. "It's Nit-Boy! Get him!" The mob surged forward, brandishing their combs. The old lady who had fainted in the market square was holding a large bottle of anti-nit shampoo called Nit-Blitz. On the label it said, "The sworn enemy of the nit. This highly toxic and foul-smelling shampoo is poisonous to all known nits. It is guaranteed to kill nits until they are totally and utterly completely dead." Unable to contain her anger a little moment longer, the old lady hurled the bottle at Nigel. It bounced off his hair and hit her on the head, knocking her out cold. The boy still stood his ground. Once again he commanded his nits. "Nits, lift!" The nits swarmed downwards to create a hoverboard under the master's feet. Now they lifted him off the ground with laughable ease. The crowd gasped in shock. The supervillain could actually fly! The boy zoomed through the night sky, performing an impressive loop-the-loop before hovering over the mob. "Now back to your homes, or you will feel the full force of Nit-Boy." The townsfolk began muttering to each other dejectedly. They knew they were beaten, yet still no one moved. "Disperse! Disperse!" Nit-Boy ordered the crowd. But his nits must have thought he was talking to them. Nits are not known for their intelligence. As far as I know, no nit has performed brain surgery or been involved in rocket science. So the nits dispersed. Led by Mr. Henderson, they all buzzed off in different directions, disappearing into the sky. Nit-Boy looked down at the people below. He gulped as he began to plummet down. He tumbled through the air desperately, flapping his arms. "Help!" The crowd surged out of the way, and Nigel landed head-first onto the pavement. Fortunately, such of the volume of his hair on the head had survived the fall without injury. "Grab him!" shouted someone. Nigel was carted off to the local hairdressers, where his hair was washed with Nit-Blitz shampoo, and he was given a very sensible short back and sides. All remaining nits or knit eggs were combed out of Nigel's hair, and he had to make a promise in front of the whole crowd. "I solemnly swear never to ever become Nit-Boy again." You might be surprised to learn that, even though he was one of the world's worst children, Nigel kept his promise. Nit-Boy was never seen ever again. However, sometime later, Nigel came up with another supervillain to be. From now on, he will be known as Veruca Boy, a supervillain who refused to wear a plastic sock at the swimming pool, thereby unleashing a plague of Verucas on the world. And the best part of that, Nigel could reuse the cape that was really his mum's old skirt. Again, fortunately, the name had not already been taken. That's the end of this chapter, folks. If you enjoyed, please do not to like and subscribe, and comment down below which book I should read after this one. See you guys in the next chapter. Bye-bye.